The wind howls through the pines, carrying with it the scent of old snow and something older still, something that lingers in the earth. Beneath the roots and the stones, Dr. Theodore Brennan stands alone at the edge of a forgotten clearing, his boots sinking into the mossy ground, his breath a pale ghost in the chill morning air. Before him, a row of wooden crosses leans at odd angles, their names and dates long since worn away by rain and time. 11 graves, each no longer than a child's cradle, arranged with a precision that feels more ritual than remembrance. He kneels, his gloved hand brushing away a drift of dead leaves from the smallest cross. The wood is splintered, the carving crude a mark of haste, or perhaps of shame. Brennan's eyes, once sharp and unyielding, are now clouded with the weight of years and memories he cannot escape. He places a single white flower at the base of the grave, its petals trembling in the wind. For a moment, the world is silent, save for the distant caw of a raven circling overhead. He remembers the first time he saw this place, the cabin standing proud and defiant against the wilderness, smoke curling from its chimney, the laughter of children echoing faintly through the trees. But that was before the truth revealed itself, before the secrets clawed their way from the shadows and demanded to be known. Now, the cabin is nothing but a skeleton, its windows gaping, its roof sagging under the weight of too many winters. The land itself seems to recoil, as if trying to forget what happened here. Brennan's hands tremble as he traces the outline of the cross. He whispers a name he has never spoken aloud, a name that belongs to no living soul. Some secrets, he knows, refuse to stay buried. They fester in the dark, waiting for the right moment to rise again. He stands, the flower left as a silent offering, and turns to face the forest. Behind him, the graves keep their vigil, guardians of a story too terrible to tell until now. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the earth itself whispering, "Remember us." The winter of 1876 pressed down on Montana like a shroud. The world outside my window reduced to a blur of light and shadow. I remember the night the warning came, a night so silent, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I was alone in my study, the fire burning low, when a frantic pounding shattered the hush. Jake Harrison, the mail carrier, stood on my threshold, his face raw with cold and something deeper fear. He thrust a letter into my hands, his words tumbling out in a hoarse whisper. "Doctor, you need to come. Something's wrong up in the mountains. The Donnelly family. It's not natural. What's happening there?" His eyes darted to the darkness behind him, as if afraid the night itself might overhear. I broke the seal with numb fingers. The message inside was brief, desperate. Childbirth gone wrong. Family asking for help. Something not right. Come quick. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smeared by trembling hands. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The Donnellys, newcomers from Ireland, living in a cabin so remote, it was said even the wolves gave it a wide berth. I had heard the rumors, strange lights at night, too many graves behind the house, children who never spoke to strangers. As I packed my bag, I could not shake the sense that I was being drawn into something far older and darker than a simple medical emergency. The snow fell heavier as I rode out, each flake erasing the world behind me, leaving only the path ahead, a path that led to the Donnelly homestead and to secrets that would stain my soul forever. Would you have turned back? Would you have ignored the warning, let the snow bury the truth for another season? Or would you, like me, have pressed on, compelled by duty or by curiosity, to open the door to the house of blood? I ask you now, as I asked myself then, would you dare to look inside, knowing some doors, once opened? Montana in 1876 was a land of contradictions, a place where hope and hardship walked hand in hand, where the promise of new beginnings was shadowed by the ever-present threat of oblivion. The territory sprawled wild and untamed, its mountains rising like the bones of ancient gods, its forests thick with secrets. For those who came seeking fortune or freedom, the land offered both sanctuary and sentence. Here, the rules of civilization were as thin as the air at high altitude, and the wilderness was always waiting to reclaim what men tried to build. Helena, the territorial capital, was little more than a cluster of rough-hewn buildings huddled against the wind. Gold fever had drawn thousands to its muddy streets, but by 1876, the rush was fading, leaving behind abandoned claims and men grown desperate. The town's population swelled and shrank with the seasons, its saloons and boarding houses filled with stories of lost fortunes and vanished friends. Law was a matter of proximity. If you lived close enough to the sheriff's office, you might expect justice. If not, you learned to keep your own counsel and your own gun. Beyond Helena, the world grew stranger still. The mountains were dotted with mining camps and lonely homesteads, each one a fragile outpost against the vastness. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles, and a single blizzard could cut a family off from the world for months. In these remote valleys, the land itself seemed to conspire against human ambition. Crops failed, livestock vanished, and sometimes so did people. A neighbor's smoke might disappear from the horizon, and no one would ask why. In Montana, silence was both a shield and a warning. It was this very isolation that drew a certain kind of settler, those with secrets to keep or pasts to outrun. The Donnelly family arrived in such a season, their wagon heavy with crates and their eyes wary. They claimed to be fleeing the hunger and violence of Ireland, seeking a place where they could begin again. But even in a land of second chances, some stains cannot be washed away. The Donnellys chose a valley so remote that the nearest neighbor was a day's ride, and the only road in was a narrow trail that vanished beneath the snow each winter. For the families who braved these mountains, community was a fragile thing. A single visit from a mail carrier or a passing trapper might be the only contact with the outside world for months. News traveled slowly, and rumors even slower, but both had a way of growing in the telling. Stories of strange lights, of children who never played in the open, of graves dug in the hard earth behind shuttered cabins. These were the currency of the frontier, traded over whiskey and firelight. Yet for all its dangers, the wilderness offered a kind of freedom unknown in the crowded cities of the East. Here, a man could reinvent himself. A family could vanish into the trees and become whatever they wished. But freedom, in such a place, came at a price. The land demanded sacrifices of comfort, of safety, sometimes of sanity. The long winters gnawed at the mind, and the silence pressed in until even the strongest felt its weight. What would you do if your neighbors vanished for months, their windows dark, their fields untended? Would you ride out to check on them, risking the cold and the unknown? Or would you turn away, telling yourself it was none of your concern, that in Montana, everyone had their reasons for keeping to themselves? In this land, the line between neighbor and stranger was as thin as the ice on a spring creek beautiful, treacherous, and always ready to break. It was into this world of shadows and silence that the Donnelly family disappeared, their secrets buried deeper than the winter snow. And it was here, on the edge of civilization, that I would come to learn just how dark the human heart can become when left alone with its own desires. They arrived in Helena on a gray September morning, their wagon creaking under the weight of trunks and crates, the horses lathered and restless from the long journey. The Donnelly family, Patrick, Bridge, and their 4 children were a curiosity from the moment their boots touched the muddy street. In a town where every newcomer was measured and cataloged by the eyes of old-timers, the Donnellys stood apart, not for their poverty or their accent, but for the way they seemed to move as a single, wary unit, as if the world itself were a threat. Patrick Donnelly was a tall man, his hair already streaked with white, despite the youth in his face. His hands, though he claimed to be a farmer, bore no calluses only, the faint stains of ink, the mark of a man more accustomed to ledgers than to plows. He spoke with a careful, educated cadence, his words chosen as if each one might be used against him. Bridge, his wife, was small and sharp-boned, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, her voice rarely rising above a whisper. She kept her children close, her fingers always brushing the shoulder or sleeve, as if afraid they might vanish if she let go. The children Seamus, Moira, Colleen, and young Declan were a study in contrasts. All shared the same pale blue eyes, the same angular features, the same unnaturally long fingers that seemed to belong to another species altogether. Yet each moved with a different kind of tension. Seamus, the eldest, flinched at sudden noises and stuttered when spoken to by strangers. Moira and Colleen, barely out of girlhood, carried themselves with a gravity that unsettled the townsfolk, their gazes too old for their years. Declan, the youngest, watched the world with a haunted, silent intensity, as if he were always listening for something only he could hear. It was not just their appearance that set the Donnellys apart, but their habits. They paid for supplies in gold coins, counting each one with obsessive care. They spoke to each other in rapid Irish, switching to English only when addressed by outsiders. They refused all offers of hospitality, declining invitations to church or supper with a polite but unyielding reserve. When asked about their past, Patrick spun a tale of famine and loss, of a farm in County Cork swallowed by blight and violence. Yet his story shifted in the telling, details rearranged like pieces on a chessboard, and no one in Helena could quite pin down where the Donnellys had come from, or what they hoped to find in the mountains. The family's arrival was the talk of the town for weeks. Some pitied them, seeing in their haunted eyes the scars of old country suffering. Others whispered that no Irishman ever carried so much gold or spoke with such careful diction. The local merchant, Mrs. Hargrove, noted how Bridge would linger over the shelves of salt and vinegar, her hands trembling as she selected jars, as if each purchase were a matter of life and death. The blacksmith, a man not given to fancy, swore he saw Patrick measuring the wheels of his wagon with a ruler, muttering numbers under his breath, as if planning for a journey no one else could see. It was the children, though, who drew the most attention. They never played with the other town kids, never laughed or shouted in the street. When spoken to, they answered in short, clipped phrases, their eyes flicking to their parents for approval. Once, Moira was seen weeping behind the general store, her face pressed to the cold glass. But when Mrs. Hargrove approached, she straightened, wiped her eyes, and offered a smile so brittle it seemed carved from ice. As the days grew shorter and the first snows dusted the mountains, the Donnellys vanished from town, their wagon loaded once more, their faces set against the wind. They had purchased a parcel of land deep in a narrow valley, a place so remote that even the most adventurous trappers hesitated to visit. The townsfolk watched them go with a mixture of relief and unease, as if a storm had passed overhead but left the air charged and unsettled. Yet for all their strangeness, there was something pitiable about the Donnellys, a sense of people driven by forces beyond their control, haunted by memories they could not escape. Some said they were running from the law, others from a curse. But as the winter closed in, and the smoke from their chimney disappeared behind the ridgeline, one thing became clear. The Donnellys had come to Montana not to be found, but to be forgotten. And in their forgetting, they left behind a silence that was more unsettling than any secret spoken long before aloud. The Donnelly name was whispered in the wilds of Montana. It was spoken in the green, rain-soaked hills of County Cork, a land of stone fences, peat fires, and secrets as old as the soil itself. In 1798, the world was changing. Revolution and famine swept across Ireland, leaving villages hollowed by hunger and fear. Yet in the village of Kilcrea, The Donnelly family prospered, their farm a patchwork of lush fields and sturdy cattle, their house standing proud atop a low hill, its windows aglow with lamplight while others flickered out. Fergus Donnelly, the patriarch, was a man of ambition and restless intellect. He read books by candlelight, his fingers stained with ink and earth, and spoke often of the future of a new Ireland, strong and unbroken. He watched his livestock with a breeder's eye, selecting the finest for mating, culling the weak without sentiment. A bloodline is a garden, he would say, and a wise man weeds his garden well. To his neighbors, Fergus was a figure of respect and suspicion, a man who kept to himself and asked little from the church or the village council. It was said that Fergus's wife, Maired, was descended from the old families, those who remembered the fairy tales and the warnings whispered at the hearth. She bore him 7 children, each more striking than the last, tall, fair, with eyes the color of storm clouds and minds quick as foxes. The Donnelly children excelled at their lessons, their music, their work in the fields. Yet there was a sameness to them, a symmetry that unsettled the villagers. They looked like they were carved from the same stone, the midwife once muttered, crossing herself as she passed their gate. The first shadow fell in the winter of 1802, when Maired gave birth to a child with twisted limbs and a mouth that could not close. The priest was called, and prayers were said, but the child did not survive the night. Fergus buried the infant himself, far from the family plot, and spoke of it to no one. But the midwife, who had seen the child's face, whispered that it was not the first such birth in the Donnelly house. Over the years, other infants were born and vanished, their names never entered in the parish register. As the seasons turned, Fergus's obsession deepened. He began to keep meticulous records charts of marriages, births and deaths, notes on the color of a child's eyes, the shape of a jaw, the quickness of a mind. He arranged marriages for his children, not by love or dowry, but by blood cousin to cousin, kin to kin. He spoke of purity and improvement, of building a family that would outlast the troubles of the world. Some called it pride, others madness, but none dared challenge him openly. The Donnelly farm became a place of both wonder and dread. Their cattle grew larger, their crops more abundant, but the laughter of children was seldom heard. The family's gatherings were marked by a strange solemnity, as if each meal were a ritual, each birth a test. The villagers kept their distance, crossing themselves when they passed the Donnelly fields, whispering that the family had made a bargain with something older and darker than God. It was in this crucible of ambition and fear that the Donnelly experiment was born, a belief that the flaws of the world could be bred out, that suffering could be conquered by will and calculation. Fergus's journals, written in a cramped, feverish hand, spoke of the improvement of the Irish stock, of eliminating weakness, of sacrifices made for the greater good. He saw himself as a pioneer, a man unafraid to do what others would not. But beneath the surface, the cost was mounting. Maired grew thin and silent, her eyes hollowed by grief. The surviving children bore the weight of their father's expectations, their lives measured and judged from the moment they drew breath. And in the village, the old stories began to change. The Donnellys were no longer just neighbors. They were a warning, a living reminder that the pursuit of perfection can birth monsters, and that some gardens, no matter how carefully tended, are sown with seeds of ruin. So it was that the Donnelly legacy began, not with a crime or a curse, but with a single monstrous idea, that blood could be made pure, and that the price of purity was a burden the family alone. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the valley in a silence so deep it seemed to swallow every sound. The Donnelly homestead, newly built and still smelling of fresh-cut pine, stood alone beneath the shadow of 2 ridges, its windows flickering with lamplight as the world outside turned to ice. By November, the trail to Helena was impassable. buried beneath drifts that rose higher than a man's waist. The family was cut off, their only company the wind and the wolves that howled in the distance. Inside the cabin, the days fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity and fear. Patrick rose before dawn, tending the fire and checking the traps he'd set along the frozen creek. Bridge rationed flour and salt, her hands moving with mechanical precision as she measured each portion, her lips moving in silent prayer. The children worked in silence, their chores performed with a discipline that bordered on the unnatural. There was no laughter, no idle talk, only the scraping of spoons against tin bowls, the creak of the rocking chair, the low murmur of Irish spoken in the shadows. As the weeks dragged on, the isolation began to gnaw at the edges of their minds. The children grew pale and thin, their eyes too large for their faces. Seamus, once quick to smile, now flinched at the sound of his father's voice. Moira and Colleen whispered together at night, their words muffled by the quilts they pulled over their heads. Declan, the youngest, took to staring out the window for hours, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the snow fall, endless and unchanging. It was during this long, dark winter that the first complication arose. Bridge, heavy with child, went into labor one night as a blizzard raged outside. The storm battered the cabin, rattling the shutters and filling the air with a sound like distant screaming. Patrick sent the children to the far room, their faces white with fear, while he and Moira tended to Bridge. The labor was long and brutal, the air thick with the smell of blood and sweat. When the child finally came, it was silent, its tiny body twisted, its face marked by a cleft that split its lip and palate. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Patrick wrapped the infant in a blanket and carried it to the hearth, his face unreadable. Bridge turned her face to the wall, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Moira stood frozen, her hands stained with her mother's blood, her eyes wide and unblinking. The other children huddled together in the cold, listening to the muffled sounds from the next room, their imaginations conjuring horrors they could not name. The next morning, the child was gone. Patrick told the children it had been too weak to survive, that God had taken it back. He forbade them to speak of it, his voice cold and final. But that night, as the wind howled outside, Seamus saw his father slip out into the snow, a small bundle cradled in his arms. He watched from the window as Patrick dug a shallow grave behind the cabin, his breath rising in clouds as he worked. When he returned, his hands were raw and bleeding, his eyes hollow. In the days that followed, a change came over the family. Bridge grew more withdrawn, her movements slow and deliberate. She began to light candles at dusk, placing them in the windows and muttering prayers in Irish that the children did not understand. Patrick grew harsher, his temper flaring at the smallest mistake. He began to enforce new rules. No one was to leave the cabin after dark. No one was to speak of the child. No one was to question the will of God or the family. The children, sensing the shift, clung to each other in the darkness. Moira and Colleen fashioned crude dolls from scraps of cloth, their faces stitched with red thread in the shape of a smile. Seamus carved small crosses from wood, hiding them beneath his pillow. Declan, who had always been the quietest, began to hum strange melodies under his breath, tunes that seemed to echo the rhythm of the wind outside. As the winter deepened, the rituals multiplied. Bridge sprinkled salt across the threshold each night, whispering words she would not translate. Patrick marked the door with ash, drawing symbols that looked like twisted branches or broken bones. The children were made to kneel in prayer before every meal, their voices rising in a chorus that sounded more like a chant than a blessing. The cabin, once a place of hope, became a fortress against the darkness, a place where fear and faith were indistinguishable. Yet for all their precautions, the sense of unease only grew. The snow outside seemed to press closer, the trees leaning in as if to listen. The wolves came nearer, their eyes glinting in the firelight. And always, behind the cabin, the small grave lay hidden beneath the drifts, a secret the family could not escape. On the last night of winter, as the first thaw began to soften the ground, Declan woke to the sound of footsteps outside his window. He crept from his bed and pressed his face to the glass, his breath fogging the pain. In the moonlight, he saw his father standing over the grave, his hands raised in supplication, his lips moving in a prayer that sounded nothing like the ones they spoke at supper. Declan watched as Patrick knelt, his head bowed, and began to dig. The next morning, the grave was gone, erased by fresh snow, as if it had never been there at all. But Declan knew what he had seen, and in the silence that followed, a new fear took root in his heart, a fear that the winter had not buried their secrets, but only given them Jake Harrison had been riding the mountain trails for 8 years, long enough to know the difference between ordinary hardship and something that gnawed at the edges of reason. He was a man of habit and few words, trusted by the scattered families who depended on his monthly visits for news, letters, and the rare comfort of a familiar face. But the Donnelly homestead unsettled him from the start. The first time he delivered mail to their cabin, the snow was still deep in the hollows, and the air was sharp with the promise of another storm. The place was too quiet, the smoke from the chimney rising in a thin, nervous thread. Jake knocked, waited, and was met by Bridge Donnelly, her eyes darting past him, as if she expected someone or something else to appear. She took the letters with trembling hands, thanked him in a voice barely above a whisper, and closed the door before he could ask after the family. It was the children who lingered in his mind. He caught glimpses of them through the frost-blurred windows, pale faces pressed to the glass, eyes wide and unblinking. Once he saw Moira and Collang moving in perfect unison, their arms laden with firewood, their mouths set in identical, silent lines. Another time, Seamus flinched away from the light as if it burned, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the ground. Declan, the youngest, never looked at Jake at all. He simply stared into the trees, as if listening for a voice only he could hear. Jake tried to dismiss his unease as the product of isolation, the way the mountains played tricks on a man's mind. But each visit brought new reasons to worry. The Donnellys never asked for supplies, never sent letters, never invited him in for tea or a warm meal. Their gold coins were always exact, their words always measured. And behind the cabin, Jake noticed a row of small wooden crosses, the earth freshly turned even in the dead of winter. One afternoon, as the thaw began to loosen the grip of snow on the land, Jake arrived to find the cabin in disarray. Boards had been hastily nailed over a broken window, and the air was thick with a sickly sweet odor he recognized from too many years on the frontier, the scent of death, poorly hidden. Bridge met him at the door, her face gaunt, her hands shaking. "We lost the baby," she said, her voice flat, her eyes dry. "Buried him behind the cabin, next to the others." Jake's skin prickled. He glanced at the graves, counting 4 where before there had been only 2. The crosses were identical, the dates carved with a careful, practiced hand. He wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. There was something in Bridge's gaze, a warning, or perhaps a plea, that told him to leave well enough alone. But Jake was not a man easily frightened. On his next visit, he arrived early, moving quietly through the trees, hoping to catch a glimpse of the family unguarded. He watched as Patrick and Seamus dug another grave, their movements efficient, their faces expressionless. He heard snatches of conversation in Irish, words he could not understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Cold, deliberate, final. Later, as dusk fell, Jake lingered near the cabin, listening. He heard the children's voices, low and urgent, speaking of the line and the sacrifices. He heard Bridge weeping, her sobs muffled by the thick log walls. And once he heard Patrick's voice, sharp and commanding. "We do what must be done. God sees and God forgives." Jake rode back to Helena that night, the weight of what he had seen pressing on his chest. He told himself it was not his place to interfere, that the mountains were full of sorrow and secrets, that every family had its burdens. But the image of those small graves haunted him, and the memory of Bridge's empty eyes would not let him rest. Would you have reported them? Would you have risked the wrath of a desperate family, the scorn of a community that prized privacy above all else? Or would you, like Jake, have carried the secret in silence, hoping that the spring thaw would wash away the blood and the guilt alike? Tell me, what would you have done, standing at the edge of the Donnellys' world, with only your conscience and the cold for company? Spring in the mountains brought no relief to the Donnelly homestead. The snow melted, revealing a landscape scarred by the long winter-dead grass, broken branches, and the uneven mounds behind the cabin, each marked by a wooden cross. A family emerged from their isolation thinner, paler, their eyes ringed with sleeplessness. Yet there was no joy in their survival, only a grim determination to continue as before. The first to notice the change was Jake Harrison. On his monthly visit, he found the children altered, their faces drawn and wary, their movements even more synchronized, as if they were actors in a play whose script allowed no improvisation. Moira's belly was already swelling again, though she was barely 17. Colleen's hands shook as she carried water from the creek, her gaze fixed on the ground. Seamus, once the strongest, now limped, his left leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Declan, the youngest, had developed a persistent cough that echoed through the trees at night. Rumors began to spread in Helena. Some said the Donnellys were cursed, others that they were hiding a sickness brought from the old country. A few whispered that the family was not alone in the cabin, that strange lights could be seen flickering at odd hours, and that the wolves had grown bold, circling the homestead as if drawn by something more than hunger. It was not long before tragedy struck again. Bridge went into labor on a night when the moon was hidden behind clouds, the air heavy with the scent of rain. The birth was difficult, the child emerging silent and blue, its limbs twisted, its eyes fused shut. Patrick examined the infant with a cold detachment, his face a mask of calculation. "It will not survive the week," he pronounced, his voice devoid of sorrow. "Best to let it go quickly." Bridge wept, her hands clutching the tiny body, but Patrick was unmoved. He wrapped the child in a cloth and carried it outside, his footsteps muffled by the wet earth. The next morning, another grave appeared behind the cabin, the soil still dark and loose. The children watched from the window, their faces expressionless, their eyes reflecting a terror too deep for words. Jake, arriving days later, found the family in a state of eerie calm. The air inside the cabin was thick, with the smell of herbs and something metallic. He tried to offer comfort, but his words fell flat. Patrick thanked him for his concern, his tone polite but final. "We handle our own troubles here," he said, closing the door with a firmness that brooked no argument. But Jake could not let go of his suspicions. That night, he circled the homestead, keeping to the shadows. Through a crack in the shutters, he saw Patrick and Bridge hunched over a table, their faces illuminated by candlelight. Between them lay a leather-bound book, its pages covered in dense, spidery writing. Patrick turned the pages with care, pausing to study detailed drawing sketches of infants with misshapen limbs, notes written in both English and Irish, diagrams of family trees branching and twisting back upon themselves. Jake's heart pounded as he realized what he was seeing. A record of births and deaths, of traits measured and catalogued, of decisions made with the cold logic of a breeder culling a herd. The Donnellys were not merely victims of misfortune. They were participants in a deliberate, generations-long experiment, one that demanded sacrifice and secrecy in equal measure. The horror deepened when Jake, emboldened by dread, crept to the back of the cabin. There, beneath a loose board, he found a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside were the preserved remains of infants' tiny bodies twisted by deformity, their skin waxen and pale, their features eerily similar. Some were marked with symbols, others with dates. The sight was so terrible that Jake staggered away, retching into the grass, his mind reeling with the enormity of what he had uncovered. He fled into the night. The image of those small, silent faces burned into his memory. He knew then that the Donnellys' suffering was not the work of chance or fate, but of a monstrous idea passed down from parent to child, a belief that purity could be achieved through pain, that the weak must be culled for the sake of the strong. Back in Helena, Jake tried to speak of what he had seen, but the words would not come. Who would believe him? Who would dare confront a family so isolated, so determined to keep their secrets? The townsfolk listened to his halting account, their faces pale, their eyes averted. Some muttered prayers, others shook their heads. "It's not our place," one man said. "Let them be. The mountains will take care of their own." But the mountains had not taken care of the Donnellys. The family's cold logic had triumphed over the natural empathy of outsiders, their rituals and rules growing ever more rigid as the years passed. The children learned to hide their fear, to obey without question, to accept the loss of siblings as the price of survival. The graves behind the cabin multiplied, each one a silent testament to the cost of the family's obsession. And in the heart of the cabin, the journals grew thicker, the drawings more detailed, the records more precise. The Donnellys had become both the architects and the victims of their own nightmare, trapped in a cycle of birth and death, hope and horror that showed no sign of ending. The discovery of the journals and the preserved remains was only the beginning. The true depth of the family's descent had yet to be revealed, and the secrets hidden in the shadows of the Donnelly homestead would soon demand a reckoning that no one, least of all Dr. Brennan, could have foreseen. When the first rumors reached me in Helena, whispers of too many graves, of children born wrong and buried quick, I tried to dismiss them as frontier gossip. But the evidence mounted, each story more troubling than the last. Jake Harrison's haunted eyes, the trembling hands of the townsfolk, the silence that fell whenever the Donnelly name was spoken. I could not ignore it. I was a man of science, trained in the new theories of heredity and disease, a student of Vienna and Berlin, where the future was being written in the language of blood and bone. Yet nothing in my education had prepared me for what I would find in the Montana wilderness. The journey to the Donnelly homestead was a trial in itself. The trail wound through dense forest and over treacherous ridges, the air growing colder with each mile. I traveled alone, my medical bag heavy with instruments and books, my mind racing with questions. What sickness could twist a family so? What curse could breed such sorrow? I told myself I was seeking answers, that I could help. But beneath my resolve was a growing dread, a sense that I was riding not toward a patient, but into the heart of a darkness older than reason. When I arrived, the cabin appeared almost ordinary. Smoke curled from the chimney, the garden was neat, the livestock healthy, but the air was thick with unease, a tension that prickled the skin. Patrick met me at the door, his face drawn and wary. He welcomed me with the stiff courtesy of a man who knows he cannot refuse, but resents the intrusion all the same. Bridge hovered in the shadows, her eyes hollow, her hands fluttering at her sides like wounded birds. Inside, the children sat in silence, their faces pale and watchful. I examined them one by one, noting the signs of malnutrition, the subtle deformities, curved spines, elongated fingers, eyes that seemed too large for their skulls. I asked gentle questions, but their answers were rehearsed, their voices flat. When I pressed, Patrick intervened, his tone polite but final. "We manage our own affairs, Doctor. The mountains are hard, but we are harder." I tried to reason with him, to explain the dangers of inbreeding, the risks of isolation. I spoke of Mendel's peas, of the new science that promised to unlock the secrets of heredity. But Patrick's eyes grew cold. "We know our blood," he said. "We know what must be done to keep it strong. Outsiders do not understand." That night, as the family slept, I pored over the journals Jake had described. They were hidden beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in oilcloth to keep out the damp. The pages were filled with meticulous records, births and deaths, sketches of infants with twisted limbs, notes on temperament and intelligence. There were charts of marriages, lines drawn between cousins and siblings, annotations in both English and Irish. The language was clinical, almost detached, but the horror was unmistakable. Here was a century of murder, justified by a twisted logic that saw children as experiments, lives as data points. I felt a cold fury rise in me. This was not science, but superstition masquerading as reason. The Donnellys had taken the language of improvement and turned it into a creed of cruelty. They spoke of purity, of strength, but what I saw was fear of weakness, fear of difference, fear of the world beyond their valley. They had built a prison from their own beliefs, and the children paid the price. The next morning, I confronted Patrick. I showed him the journals, demanded an explanation. He did not flinch. "You see only what you want to see, Doctor. You call it murder. We call it mercy. The world is not kind to the weak. Better they go quickly before they suffer, before they bring shame to the family." I argued, pleaded, threatened. I told him the law would not protect him, that the world was changing, that his secrets would not stay buried forever. But he only shook his head. "The law is far away. The mountains keep their own counsel. We do what we must." I left the cabin that day with more questions than answers. My training told me to report what I had found, to bring the authorities, to end the cycle of suffering. But the mountains were vast, the law slow, and the Donnellys desperate. I feared what might happen if I forced their hand. I feared for the children, for Bridge, for the fragile line between order and chaos that held the family together. What would you have done, standing in my place? Would you have risked everything to expose the truth, knowing it might bring only more pain? Or would you have turned away, telling yourself it was not your place, that the world is full of darkness and you cannot fight it all? I ask you now, as I asked myself then, what is the duty of a doctor, of a neighbor, of a human being, when faced with a century of murder hidden behind the mask of tradition? The Donnelly homestead faded behind me as I rode back to Helena, the journals heavy in my pack, the weight of their secrets pressing on my soul. I knew the story was not over. The reckoning was coming, and when it did, no one, least of all me, would be left unchanged. The night I returned to the Donnelly homestead, the air was thick with the scent of rain and wood smoke, the sky bruised with the threat of another storm. I carried with me a sense of foreboding, a certainty that the answers I sought would not bring comfort, but only deeper horror. The family greeted me with the same wary reserve, but there was a new tension in the air, a sense that something was unraveling, that the walls they had built around their secrets were beginning to crack. Patrick was waiting for me in the main room, the journals already laid out on the table, their leather covers worn smooth by generations of anxious hands. He did not speak as I sat down, only watched with hollow eyes as I opened the first volume. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown, but the writing was clear, the hand steady and precise. I began to read, and the world around me seemed to fall away, replaced by the cold logic of the Donnelly experiment. The earliest entries were written in the cramped, formal script of Fergus Donnelly, the patriarch who had begun it all in County Cork. He described his theories in the language of a man convinced of his own righteousness. The improvement of the Irish stock is a duty, not a choice. Weakness must be culled, strength preserved. Only through careful selection can the family line be made pure. He recorded the births of his children with the detachment of a farmer cataloging livestock, noting eye color, height, intelligence, and temperament. When a child was born with a defect, a clubbed foot, a cleft palate, a mind that did not quicken, he wrote only, unfit, released. As I turned the pages, the entries shifted from Ireland to America, the handwriting changing, but the message remaining the same. Each generation refined the process, introducing new criteria, new rituals. There were anatomical drawings, some so detailed they could have come from a medical textbook, others rough and frantic, as if sketched in the throes of panic. Infants with twisted spines, extra fingers, malformed skulls. Notes in the margins. Mother's cousin too close? Try second cousin next time. Blue eyes, strong jaw keep. Weak lungs eliminate. The genealogies were even more disturbing. Charts traced the family's bloodlines back through 5 generations, each marriage carefully arranged to concentrate what they believed were superior traits. Cousin married to cousin, uncle to niece, the lines looping back on themselves in a tightening spiral. The names of the unfit were crossed out, their dates of birth and death recorded with chilling precision. Some entries were marked with a single word, mercy, but it was the section labeled Enhancement Protocol that truly chilled my blood. Here, the language shifted from the clinical to the visionary, the handwriting growing larger, more erratic. We have learned from the breeders of horses and cattle, one entry read. The same principles apply. Select for strength, for intelligence, for beauty. Eliminate the weak, the deformed, the slow. Each generation brings us closer to perfection. There were lists of desired traits, height, pale eyes, mathematical aptitude, and instructions for pairing siblings, for testing the children's abilities, for disposing of those who failed. The drawings in this section were the most disturbing of all. One showed a pair of conjoined twins, their bodies fused at the chest, their faces identical, but for a single shared eye. Another depicted a child with a spine so twisted it formed a near-perfect circle, the head resting on the feet. There were diagrams of internal organs, notes on the best methods for release, smothering, exposure to the cold, a tincture of laudanum mixed with milk. The language was cold, almost loving in its attention to detail, as if the act of killing were a sacred duty. I felt my stomach turn as I realized the full scope of what I was reading. This was not the story of a family cursed by misfortune, but of a deliberate, systematic campaign of human experimentation carried out in secret for more than a century. The Donnellys had become both the architects and the victims of their own monstrous vision, trapped in a cycle of hope and horror that had consumed them all. As I read, I became aware of Bridge standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. She watched me with a mixture of fear and relief, as if she had been waiting her whole life for someone to see the truth. "We did what we had to do," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The world is cruel to the weak. We tried to spare them suffering. We tried to make something better." I wanted to rage at her, to demand how she could justify such cruelty, but the words died in my throat. I saw the toll it had taken on her, the hollow eyes, the trembling hands, the way she flinched at every sound. She was as much a prisoner as her children, bound by a legacy she could not escape. Patrick, too, seemed diminished, his earlier certainty replaced by a kind of desperate resignation. "My great-grandfather believed he could build a better family," he said, his voice flat. "He thought he could outwit fate. But the cost has been terrible. So many lost, so many who never had a chance." I closed the journals, my hands shaking. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. I realized then that the Donnelly experiment was not just a story of science gone wrong, but of faith twisted into fanaticism, of love corrupted by fear. They had tried to master the forces that shaped them, only to be destroyed by their own hubris. I looked at the children, huddled together in the corner, their faces a mirror of generations of suffering. I thought of the graves behind the cabin, the tiny bodies preserved in oilcloth, the names crossed out in the journals. I thought of the future, of what might happen if the cycle was not broken. Would you have the strength to read those journals, to face the truth they contained? Would you be able to look into the eyes of a family destroyed by its own ambition and see not monsters, but victims of a terrible idea? The Donnelly story was a warning, a testament to the darkness that can grow in the pursuit of perfection, and to the price paid by those who dare to play God. As the storm broke outside, rattling the windows and shaking the walls, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The secrets of the Donnelly family had been laid bare, and with them, the terrible knowledge that some wounds do not heal, and some stories do not end. They only echo down through the years, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen. The storm raged through the night, battering the Donnelly cabin with wind and rain, as if the world itself sought to wash away the sins that clung to its walls. Inside, the air was thick with fear and anticipation. The family huddled together, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes flickering between hope and dread. In the back room, Moira lay on a narrow bed, her body racked with pain, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Bridge knelt at her side, whispering prayers in Irish, her hands trembling as she wiped the sweat from her daughter's brow. I stood at the foot of the bed, my medical bag open, my mind racing. The birth had been long and brutal, the kind that leaves scars on the soul as well as the body. When the infants finally emerged, the room fell silent. They were conjoined at the chest, their tiny bodies fused, their skin pale and translucent. One child was stronger, its cries thin but insistent. The other was weak, its breath shallow, its eyes barely open. They clung to each other, two lives bound by a single fragile thread. Patrick hovered in the doorway, his face a mask of anguish and resolve. He looked at me, then at the twins, and I saw the war raging within him, the old creed of blood and strength battling against the raw, inescapable love of a father. Can they be saved? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I examined the twins, my hands gentle, my heart heavy. The truth was clear. In this place with these tools, there was nothing I could do. Even in the finest hospitals of Europe, their chances would be slim. Here in the wilderness, they had none. I explained this as gently as I could, my words falling like stones in the silence. Bridge began to weep, her body shaking with grief. Moira turned her face to the wall, her hands clenched in the blankets. The other children watched from the doorway, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if they already knew what would come next. Patrick's face hardened. He stepped forward, his voice steady but cold. We have always done what is necessary. The weak do not survive here. It is better to end their suffering now, before it grows. He looked at me, searching for agreement, for absolution. You are a doctor. You understand. I felt the weight of his words, the centuries of tradition and fear that pressed down on this family. I thought of the journals, the graves, the children lost to the pursuit of perfection. I thought of the oath I had taken, a promise to do no harm, to preserve life whenever possible. And I thought of the twins, their tiny hands entwined, their breaths coming in ragged, uncertain bursts. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the storm howled outside. I was no longer a doctor, or a man of science. I was a witness to a moment that would define the fate of a family, perhaps for generations to come. The choice before me was stark, to intervene, to insist on hope where there was none, or to step aside and allow the old ways to claim 2 more victims. Patrick's hand hovered over the twins, his eyes pleading. "It is mercy," he said, his voice breaking. "It is the only mercy we have left." I looked at Bridge, at Moira, at the children. I saw the scars they carried, the wounds that would never heal. I saw the love that still flickered beneath the fear, the desperate hope that someone might break the cycle. I turned to Patrick, my voice steady. "Mercy is not the same as murder. You have suffered enough. Let them live as long as they can. Let them know love, even if only for a few hours. Let them die in your arms, not by your hand." For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the storm, the wind rattling the shutters, the rain drumming on the roof. Then Bridge gathered the twins in her arms, cradling them close, her tears falling on their tiny faces. Moira reached out, her hand trembling, and touched her mother's shoulder. Patrick sank to his knees, his head bowed, his body shaking with silent sobs. The twins lived for 3 days. In that time, the family cared for them as best they could, feeding them drops of milk, singing to them in the old language, holding them close as the storm passed and the sun returned. When they died, it was quiet, their breaths fading together, their hands still entwined. We buried them behind the cabin, beneath a new cross, the earth soft from the rain. The family stood together, their faces streaked with tears, their hands joined. For the first time, there was no ritual, no cold logic-only grief, raw and unfiltered. Could you have made this choice? Could you have stood in that room, with the weight of history and hope pressing down on you, and chosen mercy over murder? Or would you have turned away, unable to bear the cost of compassion? I ask you now, as I asked myself then, what would you have done, standing at the edge of the abyss, with only your conscience to guide you? The storm had passed, but its shadow lingered. The Donnelly family would never be the same. The days after the twins' burial passed in a haze of exhaustion and silence. The Donnelly cabin, once a fortress of secrets and ritual, felt hollowed out, its walls echoing with the absence of cries and prayers. The family moved through the rooms like ghosts, their routines broken, their purpose lost. The old rules no longer held. The rituals that had once bound them now seemed empty, powerless against the weight of grief. Patrick aged years in a matter of weeks. His hair turned white, his shoulders stooped, and his voice lost its iron edge. He spent hours sitting by the window, staring at the graves behind the cabin, his hands trembling in his lap. Sometimes he would speak to the children, his words rambling, half mad, as if he were trying to explain the unexplainable. "We meant to make things better," he would mutter. "We only wanted to be strong." But the children no longer listened. The spell was broken. Bridge, once the vigilant guardian of her brood, withdrew into herself. She wandered the cabin at night, her footsteps soft and aimless, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant. She stopped eating, her body wasting away, her mind slipping into a fog of sorrow and guilt. The girls, Moira and Colleen, tried to care for her, but they too were changed older, harder, their innocence stripped away. They spoke little, their voices flat, their laughter gone. Seamus, the eldest, suffered the most. The stutter that had haunted him since childhood grew worse, until he could barely speak at all. He spent his days outside, wandering the woods, avoiding the cabin and the graves. Sometimes he would disappear for hours, returning with scratches on his arms and a wild look in his eyes. Declan, the youngest, grew silent and withdrawn, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if searching for a way out. Word of the family's collapse spread quickly through the valley. Jake Harrison, unable to bear the burden of what he had witnessed, finally broke his silence. He rode to Helena and told the authorities everything: the graves, the journals, The children lost to the family's twisted creed. The news sent a shockwave through the community. Some reacted with horror, others with disbelief. A few muttered that it was none of their business, that the mountains had always hidden things best left alone. The law arrived too late. By the time the sheriff and his men reached the homestead, Patrick was dead, struck down by a stroke. His body found slumped in the chair by the window, his eyes fixed on the graves. Bridge lingered for a few days more, her mind already gone, before succumbing to fever and exhaustion. The children were taken into custody, their futures uncertain. Moira and Colleen were sent to distant relatives in the east, their names changed, their pasts buried. Seamus was committed to an asylum, his mind shattered by years of fear and loss. Declan vanished one night, slipping away into the forest, never to be seen again. The Donnelly cabin was abandoned, left to rot beneath the weight of its history. The graves behind the house grew over with weeds, the crosses leaning and splintering in the wind. Locals avoided the place, crossing themselves when they passed, whispering that the land was cursed. Some said they heard crying at night or saw lights flickering in the windows long after the family was gone. Yet for all the horror, there was pity too. The community mourned the children, the lives twisted and lost by a legacy of fear. Some brought flowers to the graves, others left toys or scraps of cloth. The story of the Donnellys became a cautionary tale, a warning whispered to children on stormy nights. Beware the darkness that grows in silence. Beware the secrets that fester behind closed doors. In the end, the house was left to the elements, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and time. But the memory lingered, a scar on the land and on the hearts of those who remembered. The Donnelly family was gone, but their story remained a testament to the horrors that can grow from love twisted by fear and to the cost of mercy denied. The Donnelly tragedy did not end with the collapse of a single family or the abandonment of a lonely cabin. Its shadow stretched far beyond the valley, seeping into the cracks of American history, a warning that too few would heed. In the years that followed, whispers of similar stories surfaced in other remote corners of the country, families who kept to themselves, children who vanished, graves that multiplied in the woods. Some were dismissed as superstition, others as the inevitable toll of frontier life. But for those who had seen the Donnelly graves, who had read the journals and held the brittle bones of lost children, the pattern was unmistakable. The world was changing. Science marched forward, promising miracles and cures, but also new dangers. The same ideas that had twisted the Donnelly bloodline, belief in purity, in the right to choose who should live and who should die, began to take root in the minds of scholars and lawmakers. The word eugenics entered the public lexicon, dressed in the language of progress and reason. What had once been the secret shame of a single family became a movement, a cause championed by men in white coats and women with clipboards, their eyes bright with the certainty of their mission. Laws were passed. Institutions were built. The weak, the poor, the different were marked and measured, their fates decided by strangers who believed they knew best. The horrors of the Donnelly experiment were repeated on a grander scale, justified by science, sanctified by the state. And always the same cold logic, mercy as murder, progress as pain. Yet the wilderness kept its secrets. For every story that surfaced, a dozen more remained hidden, buried beneath the snow and the silence. How many families vanished into the trees, their names lost, their graves unmarked? How many children were sacrificed to the dream of perfection, their voices silenced before they could cry out? The mountains are full of ghosts, and the past is never as far away as we think. What lessons do we draw from the Donnelly legacy? Do we see only monsters, or do we recognize the fear and desperation that drove them? Do we comfort ourselves that such things could never happen again, or do we look honestly at the shadows that still linger at the edges of our own communities? How many secrets remain buried in America's wilderness, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to uncover them? The story of the Donnellys is not just a tale of horror, but a mirror held up to our own ambitions and anxieties. It asks us to consider the cost of progress, the dangers of unchecked power, and the thin line between compassion and cruelty. The shadow spreads, and it is up to us to decide whether we will turn away or shine a light into the darkness. What is it that drives people to cross the line between hope and horror, between the dream of a better future and the nightmare of what it takes to achieve it? The Donnelly story is not just a tale of isolation or madness. It is a meditation on the human hunger for control, for mastery over fate, and the terrible price that can be paid when that hunger goes unchecked. We like to believe that progress is always a force for good, that each new discovery, each new idea brings us closer to a more just and compassionate world. But history is littered with the bones of those who were sacrificed in the name of improvement, their suffering rationalized by the cold logic of necessity. The Donnellys believed they were building something stronger, purer, more worthy. In the end, they built only a monument to their own fear, a legacy of pain that outlived them all. It is easy to judge them from a distance, to see only the horror and not the desperation, the cruelty and not the longing for acceptance, safety, and love. But the darkness that consumed the Donnellys is not unique to one family or one time. It is a shadow that lives in every society, every heart, the temptation to draw lines, to decide who belongs and who does not, to believe that the ends justify the means. So where is the line between progress and monstrosity? Is it drawn by science, by faith, by law, or by the quiet voice of conscience that whispers when all others are silent? Would you have had the courage to speak out, to intervene, to break the cycle? Or would you, like so many, have turned away, telling yourself it was not your place, not your burden? I invite you to share your thoughts below. Where do you see the line? What lessons do you take from the Donnelly story? In a world still haunted by the pursuit of perfection, how do we ensure that our compassion is not lost to our ambition? The darkness within is always waiting. It is up to us to decide whether we will face it or let it grow. Thank you for walking with me through the shadows of the Donnelly story, a journey into the heart of darkness, where love and fear, hope and horror are forever entwined. If you've made it this far, you are among the few willing to look unflinchingly at the secrets history tries to hide. But remember, the Donnellys are not alone in the annals of forgotten horror. There are other houses of blood, other families whose secrets lie buried beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. In the coming weeks, we'll open new doors, explore new mysteries, and confront the truths that others would rather leave in the dark. So, if you crave more stories that challenge your courage and your conscience, make sure to subscribe and join our community of seekers. And ask yourself, what if the Donnelly secret was never truly buried? What if, somewhere out there, the shadows are stirring once again? Until next time, keep your lanterns lit, your questions sharp, and your heart open to the darkness that still lingers at the edge of the world.